September 1992. A young woman drives home from work through Silicon Valley's quiet streets, unaware that someone watches from the shadows. Her Honda Civic will be found the next morning, windows up, engine cold. Inside, police discover a brilliant computer engineer named Lori Houts, strangled with rope, her promising life cut short at 25. The crime shakes Mountain View, California, a place known for innovation, not violence. For 30 years, the case haunts everyone it touches. Fingerprints lead to a suspect. 2 trials fail. The accused vanishes overseas, building a new life, while Lori's family clings to fading hope. Evidence sits sealed in storage, waiting for science to catch up with justice. Then, in 2020, DNA analysts re-examine the murder weapon itself. Among mixed genetic profiles emerges a conclusive match, linking the past to the present with undeniable clarity. The rope that once held only silence now speaks the truth. When did justice become a waiting game between memory and technology? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The Adobe Systems parking lot emptied slowly on September 5, 1992. Glass towers reflected the setting sun across Silicon Valley, painting everything in amber light. Inside, Building 3, computer engineer Lori Houts saved her final program of the day and powered down her workstation. At 25, she moved through the tech world with quiet confidence. Her colleagues respected her intellect. Her friends cherished her warmth. She pulled her purse over her shoulder and walked toward the elevator, heels clicking against polished floors. "See you Monday, Lori," called a coworker from across the hallway. She turned and smiled. "Have a good weekend." The elevator doors closed. Security cameras captured her walking across the lobby, pushing through glass doors into the evening air. Her Honda Civic sat in its usual spot, 3rd row from the building. She unlocked the door, settled behind the wheel, and started the engine. The digital clock read 6:47 p.m. She had plans: dinner with her boyfriend, maybe a movie. Simple pleasures for a woman building her career in a male-dominated industry. She pulled out of the parking space and drove toward the exit. Traffic moved smoothly along the peninsula. Radio stations played familiar songs. The world felt ordinary, predictable, safe. She never made it home. Her boyfriend waited through the evening, checking his watch, calling her office line. By midnight, worry turned to panic. By morning, fear became reality. Lori Houts had vanished somewhere between Adobe Systems and the life she was supposed to live. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit tech community. Missing person flyers appeared on bulletin boards. Friends called friends, asking the same question: "Have you heard from Lori?" The answer was always no. Dawn broke gray and cool on September 6, 1992. A jogger running along Crittenden Lane noticed a Honda Civic parked at an odd angle near the roadside. Windows up, engine off, no driver in sight. Something felt wrong. The jogger approached cautiously. Through the passenger window, he glimpsed what looked like someone slumped in the front seat. He knocked on the glass. No response. Heart pounding. He ran to the nearest house and called 911. Mountain View. Police arrived within minutes. The responding officer peered through the window and immediately radioed for backup. Inside the car, a young woman sat motionless, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. A rope was wrapped tight around her neck. Detective arrived as the crime scene team began processing evidence. He studied the scene through the window before authorizing entry. No signs of struggle inside the vehicle. Purse intact on the passenger seat. Keys still in the ignition. Victim appears to be in her 20s, detective noted into his recorder. Cause of death appears to be strangulation. Rope is still around the neck. Feet appear to be bound with similar material. The rope caught his attention immediately. It wasn't common household twine or shoelaces. This looked deliberate, like someone had come prepared. Paramedics confirmed what everyone already knew. The woman was dead, likely for several hours. The coroner's team carefully extracted her body, preserving every detail for analysis. Within an hour, they had identified her. Lori Houts, 25, employed at Adobe Systems. Her boyfriend's frantic calls to police the night before suddenly made tragic sense. News vans began arriving by noon. Headlines formed in reporters' minds. Engineer found slain near Adobe. The story had everything that captured public attention: a young professional, a brutal crime, a community in shock. Detectives sealed the car and ordered it towed to the police evidence garage. Every fiber, every fingerprint, every trace of evidence would be cataloged and preserved. The investigation had begun. Inside Mountain View Police Headquarters, the forensics team worked methodically through the evidence collected from Lori's Honda Civic. Detective spread crime scene photographs across his desk, studying each image for details that might have been missed. The rope demanded immediate attention. Thick, yellow-brown nylon cord, the kind used for marine or industrial purposes. Not something most people kept in their garage. Someone had brought this specifically for the crime. Fingerprint analyst worked carefully around the car's exterior, dusting for prints on door handles, windows, and the trunk. Most surfaces revealed only smudged marks, but one partial print on the rear passenger door came through clearly. "Got something here," fingerprint analyst called out. "Clear ridge pattern, good detail. This one's going to give us an identity." The print went immediately to the California DOJ database. Within hours, a match came back. John Kevin Woodward, 29 years old, no prior felony convictions. Detective pulled Woodward's file. Clean record, employed in the tech industry, lived in Mountain View. Then came the connection that made detectives' pulse quicken. Woodward was listed as an emergency contact for Lori's boyfriend. "They know each other," detective told his partner. "This isn't random." But what really caught their attention were the smudged prints around the clear one. Someone had tried to wipe the car clean but missed this single damning mark. The attempt to cover tracks suggested planning, awareness of evidence, fear of discovery. Detective pulled phone records and began mapping relationships. Woodward and Lori's boyfriend were roommates. Woodward had access to Lori's schedule, her habits, her car. He would have known when she worked late, which route she took home. The evidence room sealed Lori's Honda Civic under strict chain of custody. Every fiber from the seats, every fingerprint from the surfaces, every trace of DNA from the rope would be preserved for future analysis. By evening, rumors circulated through Adobe Systems hallways. Coworkers whispered about jealousy, obsession, and the quiet tension they'd sensed between Lori and her boyfriend's possessive roommate. The case was taking shape. Detective began interviewing Lori's inner circle the next morning. Friends described her as driven but grounded, someone who balanced professional ambition with personal relationships. They painted a picture of a woman in control of her life until someone took that control away. Lori's boyfriend sat across from Detective in the sterile interview room, his hands shaking as he answered questions. He'd shared an apartment with Woodward for 2 years, he explained. They'd been friends since college, both working in Silicon Valley's expanding tech scene. "John was intense about our friendship," Lori's boyfriend said carefully. "He didn't like when I spent time away from the apartment." Detective leaned forward. "What about when you started dating Lori?" "He changed, became resentful, said she was taking me away from him." Other friends corroborated the story. Woodward had made his displeasure obvious. At group dinners, he sat silently while Lori spoke. At parties, he found reasons to interrupt their conversations. Several people remembered him making cutting remarks about her career, her ambitions, her place in their friend group. "He told me once that Lori changed everything," recalled a witness, "said things were better before she came around." The picture emerging was one of possessive jealousy masked as friendship. Woodward had built his identity around his relationship with Lori's boyfriend. Her presence threatened that dynamic, creating resentment that festered in private moments. A former coworker remembered Woodward waiting near Adobe's parking garage one evening, watching Lori leave work. When questioned about it, he'd claimed to be in the neighborhood. The explanation felt hollow even then. Detective documented every statement, every observation, every moment of tension witnesses could recall. The evidence painted a clear picture of motive, obsession, jealousy, and rage building toward a violent conclusion. But motive alone wouldn't secure a conviction. They needed more than fingerprints and testimony. They needed proof that Woodward had been in that car, had touched that rope, had committed the ultimate act of control. The forensic evidence would have to speak louder than memory. By 1993, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office felt confident enough to file charges. Prosecutors stood before the media, announcing that John Kevin Woodward would face first-degree murder charges in the death of Lori Houts. "The evidence shows clear motive, means, and opportunity," prosecutor declared. "The defendant's fingerprints place him at the scene. Witness testimony establishes his resentment toward the victim. This was a calculated, personal crime." The courtroom filled with Adobe employees, Lori's family, and curious locals. Silicon Valley had never seen a case quite like this, jealousy and violence erupting from the tech community's supposed civility. Defense attorney challenged every piece of evidence. The fingerprints could have been left innocently, he argued. Woodward had visited Lori's car before, riding with the couple on social occasions. The print proved presence, not murder. "Circumstantial evidence," defense attorney told the jury. "My client's feelings about the victim, however unpleasant, do not constitute proof of murder. The prosecution asks you to convict based on assumptions, not facts." Prosecutor presented the rope evidence, the bindings, the brutal nature of the crime. Strangulation required intimacy, control, sustained intent. This wasn't a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. Someone had planned this death. But without DNA evidence, the technology still primitive. In 1993, the case relied heavily on witness testimony and circumstantial connections. The fingerprint evidence was strong but not conclusive. Reasonable doubt crept into deliberations. After 3 days, the jury announced they couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. Hung jury, the judge declared a mistrial. Prosecutor immediately announced plans to retry the case. Justice delayed is not justice denied, he told reporters. This family deserves answers, and we will pursue them. The community watched, with growing frustration. Clear evidence seemed to point to Woodward's guilt, yet the legal system had failed to deliver justice. Lori's family sat in the courtroom, watching their daughter's killer walk free on bail. The case would return to court, but faith in the system had already begun to crack. The second trial began in 1994, with renewed determination from the prosecution. They refined their arguments, strengthened witness testimony, and presented the evidence with greater clarity. But the fundamental challenge remained: no DNA, no definitive physical proof. Defense attorney mounted the same strategy with greater confidence. He attacked the fingerprint evidence more aggressively, suggesting contamination or innocent contact. He portrayed Woodward as an awkward man whose social discomfort had been misinterpreted as murderous intent. Jealousy is not a crime, defense attorney reminded the jury. Disliking someone is not grounds for conviction. The prosecution wants you to fill gaps in their evidence with speculation and bias. Prosecutor fought back with emotional testimony from Lori's friends and family. They described her vibrant personality, her bright future, her tragic end. But emotions couldn't bridge the gap left by missing physical evidence. The rope that had strangled Lori sat in the evidence room, its fibers holding secrets that 1990s technology couldn't unlock. The DNA trapped in its twisted strands remained silent, waiting for science to develop methods that could give it voice. The second jury deliberated longer, but reached the same impasse. Without DNA evidence directly linking Woodward to the murder weapon, reasonable doubt persisted. The case collapsed again. This time, the judge dismissed the charges entirely. Double jeopardy laws prevented future prosecution unless new evidence emerged. Woodward walked out of the courthouse, a free man. The system failed Lori, her sister told reporters through tears. But we won't give up. Someday, science will catch up to justice. Prosecutor held a somber press conference. This case will remain open. Evidence has been preserved. If technology advances to provide new proof, we will pursue it. Woodward disappeared from public view within months. Rumors circulated that he'd left the country, starting fresh where his past couldn't follow. The case faded from headlines, but not from memory. In the evidence room, Lori's rope waited in sealed storage, holding truth that would remain hidden for another quarter-century. Years passed like pages turning in a book nobody wanted to read. Woodward built a new life across the Atlantic, eventually becoming CEO of ReadyTech in the Netherlands. His past became a distant shadow, known only to a few who chose not to speak. Silicon Valley evolved around Lori's absence. Adobe Systems grew into a global corporation. The parking lot where she'd last been seen alive was repaved, the building renovated. New employees arrived who'd never heard her name, but Lori's family refused to let memory fade. Her sister organized annual memorial services, keeping the case alive in local media. Every September 6th, friends gathered to share stories about the brilliant young woman whose life had been stolen. Detective, now a lieutenant, kept Lori's file in his desk drawer. Other cases demanded attention, but he never forgot the rope that had held secrets beyond his reach. He watched forensic science advance, hoping each breakthrough might finally unlock the truth. In the evidence room, Lori's Honda Civic and all its contents remained perfectly preserved. Chain of custody records showed every person who'd accessed the materials, every test that had been conducted, every piece that had been analyzed. Nothing was lost, contaminated, or misplaced. The rope lay coiled in its evidence bag, wrapped in plastic and stored at controlled temperature. DNA technology of the 1990s had been too crude to extract meaningful profiles from complex mixtures, but the biological material remained intact, waiting for methods that didn't yet exist. Crime labs across the country began experimenting with new extraction techniques: touch DNA, mitochondrial analysis, and improved amplification methods promised to unlock evidence that had previously been unreadable. Lori's case joined thousands of others in the cold case files, not forgotten, but waiting. Waiting for science to catch up with justice, waiting for technology to give voice to the silent evidence. The rope knew who had touched it, who had tied it, who had used it to end a life. Someday, it would tell that story. In 2020, the Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory launched an ambitious cold case review program. Advances in DNA technology had revolutionized forensic analysis. Evidence once considered too degraded or mixed for testing could now yield conclusive results. Laboratory scientists opened the file on Lori Houts with careful attention. 28 years had passed since the murder, but the evidence had been meticulously preserved. Every item remained in its original packaging, chain of custody intact. The rope drew immediate focus. Previous testing in the 1990s had detected mixed DNA profiles, but lacked the technology to separate individual contributors. New methods could now distinguish between genetic material from different sources, even in complex mixtures. Laboratory scientists carefully removed small fiber samples from areas where handling would have been necessary, the knots, the areas that would have required direct contact to tie and position around Lori's neck. The samples went through extraction processes that hadn't existed during the original trials. The laboratory's new equipment could amplify tiny amounts of genetic material and separate mixed profiles with unprecedented accuracy. Computer software analyzed the results, comparing them against the CODIS database and existing reference samples from the original investigation. Days passed as the analysis progressed. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, the computer generated a match report that made laboratory scientists' hands tremble. The DNA profile extracted from the rope's fibers matched John Kevin Woodward with statistical certainty exceeding 99.9%. The analysis showed no signs of degradation or contamination. The genetic material had been perfectly preserved. For nearly 3 decades, laboratory scientists immediately called Mountain View Police Department. Lieutenant, the same detective who'd worked the original case, listened to the news in stunned silence. "You're absolutely certain?" Lieutenant asked. "The match is conclusive," laboratory scientist replied. "No question." The rope had finally found its voice. After 28 years of silence, Lori's murder weapon was ready to speak the truth. Mountain View Police Department experienced a quiet earthquake when the DNA results arrived. Lieutenant, now gray-haired and months from retirement, reopened the Houts file with hands that remembered every detail. The evidence had always pointed to Woodward, but DNA provided the missing link between suspicion and proof. His fingerprints placed him at the car. His motive was clear. Now his genetic material tied him directly to the murder weapon. Lieutenant contacted the Santa Clara County District Attorney's office immediately. District Attorney Jeff Rosen reviewed the case personally, understanding its significance not just for justice but for demonstrating how modern science could resurrect cold cases. "This changes everything," District Attorney Rosen told his team. "We have physical proof linking the suspect to the murder weapon itself. Combined with the existing evidence, this case is prosecutable." Detective, a new investigator assigned to the cold case unit, began reconstructing the investigation file. Every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every detail from the 1990s trials was re-examined in light of the DNA breakthrough. The motive remained crystal clear. Woodward's obsessive jealousy toward Lori had festered until it exploded into violence. Friends' statements from 30 years ago suddenly carried new weight when backed by genetic evidence. Social media buzzed with renewed interest. True crime forums rediscovered the Houts case, analyzing old newspaper clippings and court documents. Podcasters began investigating the story, drawn by the compelling narrative of justice finally served. Lori's sister received the news with tears of relief and renewed grief. "I always knew this day would come," she told Detective. Science would eventually catch up to the truth, but legal challenges lay ahead. Woodward had lived abroad for decades, building a new identity as a successful businessman. Extraditing him would require coordination between multiple countries and law enforcement agencies. The rope that had waited in silence was ready to speak. Now the legal system had to find its voice as well. District Attorney Jeff Rosen convened his senior prosecutors to review the revived case. The conference room filled with files, evidence photos, and DNA reports spanning 3 decades. The original prosecution was sound, District Attorney Rosen explained. They had motive, they had fingerprints, they had witness testimony. What they lacked was the physical link to the murder weapon. Now we have that link. Assistant District Attorney reviewed the 1990s trial transcripts, noting how defense attorney had successfully argued that fingerprints alone weren't sufficient for conviction. The DNA evidence eliminated that defense strategy entirely. "He touched that rope," Assistant District Attorney concluded. "His genetic material is embedded in the fibers. There's no innocent explanation for that contact." The press release carefully balanced triumph with respect for Lori's memory. District Attorney Rosen emphasized that modern forensic technology had vindicated the original investigation's direction while providing the proof needed for justice. "Science has given us the evidence we needed to pursue this case," District Attorney Rosen announced. "DNA doesn't lie, and it doesn't fade with time." Legal experts praised the case as a model for cold case prosecution. Proper evidence preservation had made the breakthrough possible. Chain of custody had remained unbroken for 30 years. The investigation had been conducted with such care that new technology could seamlessly build upon old evidence. The Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory became a focal point for media attention. Their methodical approach to cold case review promised hope for thousands of other unsolved crimes. But District Attorney Rosen remained focused on practical challenges. Woodward lived overseas under his own name, apparently confident that time had buried his past. The murder warrant had never been withdrawn, it had simply been waiting for new evidence to support arrest. International law enforcement agencies began coordinating Woodward's apprehension. His successful business career had made him a public figure, making surveillance and planning easier for authorities. Justice was finally within reach. Across the Atlantic in Amsterdam, John Kevin Woodward maintained his carefully constructed life as ReadyTech's CEO. 28 years had passed since Lori's murder. He'd built a reputation as an innovative leader in the tech industry, his past buried beneath layers of professional success. But law enforcement agencies were quietly watching. Interpol had been notified of the renewed murder warrant. Dutch authorities coordinated with American officials, tracking Woodward's movements and travel plans. U.S. Customs and Border Protection flagged Woodward's passport in their system. If he attempted to enter the United States, alerts would immediately notify California authorities. The trap was set. They simply had to wait for him to step into it. In July 2022, Woodward booked a flight from Amsterdam to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. Travel records showed he planned to conduct business meetings on the East Coast before returning to Europe. Federal authorities monitored his departure from Amsterdam. The flight crossed the Atlantic, carrying a man who believed his past was safely buried, unaware that DNA technology had resurrected evidence that would destroy his carefully built life. Meanwhile, Mountain View police prepared for what they hoped would be the culmination of a 30-year investigation. Detective updated arrest warrants, coordinated with federal marshals, and reviewed extradition procedures. The rope that had waited in evidence storage for 3 decades was about to have its day in court. Laboratory scientists prepared detailed reports explaining how DNA extraction and analysis had revealed Woodward's genetic signature in the fibers. Lori's family received word that the arrest was imminent. Her sister canceled travel plans to remain available for media interviews. After 30 years of waiting, justice was finally approaching. The flight descended toward JFK Airport. In a few hours, John Kevin Woodward would discover that time had not erased his crimes. It had only preserved them for a more precise accounting. JFK International Airport buzzed with typical summer activity on July 15, 2022. Flight KL 641 from Amsterdam taxied toward the gate carrying passengers unaware that one among them was about to make international headlines. John Kevin Woodward retrieved his carry-on luggage and proceeded toward customs like any business traveler. At 69, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to first-class treatment and executive privilege. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officer scanned Woodward's passport. The computer screen immediately flashed red alerts. Additional security personnel surrounded him as other passengers continued through the checkpoint. "Sir, please step aside," Customs officer instructed. "There's an issue with your entry that needs to be resolved." Woodward appeared confused, then concerned. He'd traveled freely for decades. His passport was valid, his visa current. What could possibly be wrong? "I'm here on business," Woodward explained. "I'm the CEO of ReadyTech Corporation." Within minutes, federal marshal arrived with an arrest warrant dating back to 1994. The warrant had never expired, never been withdrawn, never been forgotten. It had simply waited for this moment. "John Kevin Woodward, you're under arrest for the murder of Lori Houts," federal marshal announced. "You have the right to remain silent." Woodward's face went pale. The name he hadn't heard spoken in decades echoed through the detention area. Other travelers stared as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. News outlets received alerts within hours. Cold case CEO, arrested at JFK. The story spread rapidly through social media, connecting past and present in a narrative that captured public imagination. Extradition proceedings began immediately. California authorities had prepared meticulously for this moment, ensuring no legal technicalities could delay Woodward's return to face justice. After 30 years of freedom, the past had finally caught up with him. The rope's DNA evidence had spoken across decades, demanding an accounting for Lori Houts' stolen life. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office scheduled a press conference for the day after Woodward's arrest. Media outlets from across the country requested attendance. The case had captured national attention as a symbol of forensic justice long delayed. District Attorney Jeff Rosen stood behind a podium lined with microphones, flanked by Mountain View Police Department leadership and crime lab officials. Behind them, a large photograph of Lori Houts reminded everyone why they were gathered. 30 years ago, a brilliant young woman was murdered in our community, District Attorney Rosen began. Today, advances in DNA technology have provided the evidence needed to pursue justice for Lori Houts and her family. He explained how the rope used to strangle Lori had been perfectly preserved since 1992. New extraction methods had revealed John Kevin Woodward's genetic material, embedded in the fibers genetic material that could only have been deposited through direct handling of the murder weapon. The defendant had motive, jealousy, and obsession documented by multiple witnesses. District Attorney Rosen continued. He had means access to the victim and the murder weapon. He had opportunity knowledge of her schedule and habits. Now we have physical proof linking him directly to the crime. Lieutenant spoke about the investigation's evolution over 3 decades. Despite failed trials in the 1990s, evidence had been meticulously preserved. Every fiber, every fingerprint, every DNA sample had been maintained with perfect chain of custody. Science gave us what we needed, Lieutenant explained. The evidence was always there. We just had to wait for technology to catch up. The revelation shocked the community that had followed the case for 30 years. Comments flooded social media as people processed the news that justice might finally be served. The press conference concluded with District Attorney Rosen's promise. We will pursue this case with the full resources of our office. Lori Houts deserves justice, and her family deserves closure. The rope had finally found its voice. Woodward's extradition to California proceeded swiftly through federal courts. Within weeks, he found himself in a Santa Clara County jail cell, facing charges he thought time had buried forever. Defense attorney appointed to represent Woodward immediately challenged the DNA evidence. In pre-trial motions, the defense argued that 30 years of storage had compromised the genetic material's integrity. This evidence has been sitting in a warehouse for 3 decades, defense attorney argued before judge. Degradation, contamination, and cross-contamination are inevitable. The state cannot prove the DNA profile is reliable. Prosecutor countered with detailed chain of custody records and expert testimony from laboratory scientists. The evidence had been stored, under optimal conditions, with strict environmental controls. Multiple quality checks confirmed the DNA's integrity. The defendant's genetic signature is clear and unmistakable, prosecutor explained. Advanced testing methods have confirmed what couldn't be detected 30 years ago. The science is sound. Judge ordered independent verification of the DNA results by a second laboratory. The testing confirmed the original findings with identical results. Woodward's genetic profile matched the material extracted from the rope with statistical certainty. Defense attorney shifted strategy, arguing that DNA could have been transferred indirectly. Perhaps Woodward had touched something that later contacted the rope. Perhaps contamination occurred during evidence collection. But prosecutor presented evidence that demolished this theory. The DNA was recovered from inside the rope's twisted fibers, in areas that required direct handling to tie the knots that secured it around Lori's neck. This isn't transfer DNA, prosecutor explained. This is direct contact DNA deposited through the act of tying and positioning the murder weapon. Public interest intensified as legal arguments played out in courtroom hearings. True crime enthusiasts followed every development, debating evidence and legal strategy in online forums. The rope's testimony was proving difficult to discredit. Mountain View police detective began the delicate process of re-interviewing witnesses from the original investigation. 30 years had passed, but many of Lori's friends and colleagues still lived in the Bay Area. One by one, they returned to police headquarters to share memories preserved by trauma and time. Their stories remained remarkably consistent with statements given in 1992 and 1993. Witness who had worked with Lori at Adobe Systems recalled Woodward's uncomfortable presence at office social events. He would stare at her with this intensity that made everyone uncomfortable, witness explained. It was obvious he resented her relationship with his roommate. Another witness remembered a chilling conversation from just weeks before the murder. Woodward had expressed his frustration that Lori was ruining everything between him and his friend. He said he wished she would just disappear, witness testified. The way he said it, there was real hatred in his voice. Former neighbor described seeing Woodward near Lori's apartment building on several occasions, appearing to watch her routine. When confronted, he'd claimed to be visiting friends in the area, but no friends could confirm his presence. The most disturbing testimony came from co-worker who remembered Woodward making a specific threat. During a group dinner in August 1992, he'd allegedly said, "Someone should do something about Lori before she destroys everything." Detective documented each statement carefully, building a comprehensive picture of escalating obsession. The DNA evidence provided proof of contact with the murder weapon, but witness testimony established the emotional foundation for the crime. Social media responded with renewed outrage as these details emerged through court filings. Justice for Lori began trending as people shared the story of a brilliant young woman silenced by jealous rage. The case was becoming more than a murder prosecution. It was a symbol of how time and technology could finally serve justice. Laboratory scientists prepared comprehensive reports, explaining how DNA extraction and analysis had evolved since the 1990s. The technical details would be crucial for jury understanding and conviction. The original testing in 1992 had detected multiple DNA contributors on the rope, but lacked technology to separate individual profiles. The genetic material appeared as an unreadable mixture, scientifically interesting but legally useless. By 2020, new amplification methods could detect DNA from samples containing as few as dozens of cells. Computer software could mathematically separate mixed profiles and identify individual contributors with statistical certainty. We can now read genetic information from evidence that was previously uninterpretable, laboratory scientist explained in pretrial testimony. The DNA was always there, we just needed better tools to see it. The rope had yielded multiple genetic profiles, as expected from evidence handled by paramedics, police officers, and coroner staff. But embedded deep in the fiber structure, protected from contamination, was genetic material that could only have been deposited during the original crime. Prosecutor arranged for demonstrative evidence to help jurors understand the science. Visual presentations would show how DNA degrades over time, how it can be preserved under proper conditions, and how modern testing distinguishes between different contributors. Expert witness from the California Department of Justice reviewed the laboratory's procedures and confirmed their accuracy. The testing had followed established protocols with appropriate controls and quality assurance measures. This is textbook DNA analysis, expert witness concluded. The results are reliable and scientifically sound. Defense attorney prepared counter-arguments challenging the statistical calculations and probability assessments. But the mathematical foundation of DNA analysis had withstood decades of legal scrutiny. The rope was proving to be an unshakable witness, its genetic testimony immune to the passage of time. The trial of People v. Woodward began on a crisp October morning in 2023. Judge called the court to order, as news cameras captured the historic moment. 31 years after Lori's murder, justice was finally within reach. Prosecutor delivered opening statements that connected past and present with surgical precision. In 1992, John Kevin Woodward strangled Lori Houts with a rope. His fingerprints were on her car. His DNA is on the murder weapon. His motive was jealousy and obsession. The courtroom listened intently as prosecutor described how Woodward's possessive attachment to Lori's boyfriend had festered into deadly rage. Multiple witnesses would testify about his resentment and threatening behavior. Science has given us what we needed to prove this case, prosecutor continued. DNA doesn't lie. DNA doesn't forget. And DNA from the rope that killed Lori Houts points directly to the defendant. Defense attorney countered with arguments about time's erosion of evidence and memory. 30 years have passed since this crime. Memories fade, evidence degrades. The prosecution asks you to convict based on degraded genetic material and decades-old recollections. He emphasized the circumstantial nature of much evidence and challenged jurors to consider how time might have distorted the investigation. Reasonable doubt exists when science cannot provide certainty, and certainty fades with every passing year. The jury, carefully selected from citizens with no prior knowledge of the case, faced a historic responsibility. They would decide whether modern forensic science could resurrect justice from the distant past. Lori's sister sat in the front row, clutching a photograph of her murdered sibling. After 3 decades of waiting, the final chapter was beginning. Judge reminded the jury that their duty transcended time. You must determine guilt or innocence, based on evidence, regardless of how long that evidence has waited to be heard. The rope's moment had arrived. Laboratory scientist took the witness stand as the prosecution's key expert. Her testimony would make or break the case, translating complex genetic science into language jurors could understand and trust. DNA is like a genetic fingerprint, laboratory scientist explained. Every person has a unique genetic profile that can be detected from biological material left behind through contact. Prosecutor guided her through the technical process, step by step. The rope had been sectioned carefully, with samples taken from areas that would have required direct handling during the crime. Each sample underwent rigorous testing with multiple controls to prevent contamination. The genetic profile we recovered matches John Kevin Woodward, with a probability exceeding 99.99%. Laboratory scientists testified. The statistical likelihood that this DNA came from someone else is essentially zero. Visual displays showed the genetic markers that created Woodward's unique profile. Jurors examined enlarged photographs of the rope's fiber structure, seeing where biological material had been embedded during the original crime. This DNA was deposited through direct contact, laboratory scientist continued. The genetic material is located in areas of the rope that would have been touched during the tying process, specifically in the knots used to secure it around the victim's neck. Defense attorney cross-examined, aggressively, questioning storage conditions and testing procedures. "Isn't it true that DNA can degrade over 30 years?" he asked. "DNA can degrade under poor conditions," laboratory scientist replied, "but this evidence was stored under optimal conditions, with strict environmental controls. The genetic material remained intact and interpretable." Defense attorney pressed further. "Could this DNA have been transferred indirectly, perhaps from a surface the defendant had touched?" "No," laboratory scientist answered firmly. "Transferred DNA typically appears in much smaller quantities in different locations. This profile was recovered from deep within the rope's fiber structure, consistent with direct handling during the crime," prosecutor concluded, with a powerful demonstration. Laboratory scientists showed how modern DNA analysis could distinguish between different contributors in mixed samples, revealing individual profiles that had been invisible to 1990s technology. "Science gave us the tools to hear what this evidence was trying to tell us," laboratory scientist concluded. After 30 years of silence, the rope finally spoke. The jury absorbed the technical testimony with visible concentration. Science had provided the missing link between suspicion and proof. Defense attorney mounted an aggressive challenge to the DNA evidence, bringing in his own expert witness to question the laboratory's procedures and conclusions. The battle over scientific reliability would determine the case's outcome. "DNA analysis is only as reliable as the conditions under which evidence is stored," defense expert testified. 30 years of storage, even under optimal conditions, introduces possibilities of degradation and contamination. Defense expert questioned whether the genetic profile was truly complete enough for definitive identification. He suggested that missing data points could indicate degradation that affected the analysis's reliability. "When genetic material degrades, we can see what we want to see," defense expert argued. "Partial profiles can appear to match when complete profiles might tell a different story." But prosecutors' cross-examination revealed weaknesses in the defense theory. Chain of custody records showed that evidence had been accessed only by authorized personnel, following strict protocols. Temperature and humidity logs confirmed optimal storage conditions throughout the 30-year period. "Are you suggesting that the Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory fabricated these results?" prosecutor asked. "I'm suggesting that degraded DNA can produce misleading results," defense expert replied carefully. Laboratory scientist returned to the stand for rebuttal testimony. She presented quality control data, showing that the DNA profile was complete and unambiguous. Multiple confirmatory tests had produced identical results. "This is one of the clearest genetic profiles I've analyzed in 20 years of forensic work," laboratory scientist testified. "There is no ambiguity in the identification." Judge allowed the jury to examine the actual evidence, the rope segments used for testing, the laboratory reports, and the genetic analysis software outputs. They could see for themselves the scientific foundation underlying the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys' challenges had failed to undermine the DNA evidence's reliability. The rope's testimony remained unshaken, its genetic message clear across 3 decades of time. The prosecution called witnesses whose memories had been preserved by trauma and loss. 30 years had passed, but their recollections of Woodward's behavior remained vivid and disturbing. Former coworker took the stand first, describing the uncomfortable tension that surrounded Woodward whenever Lori was present. "He couldn't hide his resentment," former coworker testified. "It was obvious to everyone that he resented her relationship with his roommate." Witness recalled a conversation from August 1992, just weeks before the murder. Woodward had complained bitterly about Lori's influence on his friend, saying she was ruining everything and needed to be stopped. The hatred in his voice was frightening. Witness explained. It wasn't just dislike, it was something much darker. Former neighbor described seeing Woodward lurking near Lori's apartment building on multiple occasions. When questioned, he'd offered vague explanations about visiting friends, but no one could confirm his presence. He was watching her, former neighbor testified, learning her patterns, her schedule. It felt predatory. The most damaging testimony came from restaurant server, who had worked at the establishment where Lori's friend group frequently gathered. In September 1992, just days before the murder, Woodward had made a chilling statement. He said someone should do something about Lori before she destroyed everything, restaurant server testified. The way he said it, there was real menace behind the words. Defense attorney challenged each witness on the accuracy of 30-year-old memories. "Can you be certain of the exact words spoken 3 decades ago?" he asked repeatedly. But the witnesses' accounts remained consistent with statements given immediately after the crime. Their memories had been crystallized by the shock of Lori's murder, and their growing realization that someone they knew had likely committed the crime. Lori's sister listened to each testimony with tears streaming down her face. The witnesses were painting a picture of escalating obsession that had culminated in her sister's death. Closing arguments began with prosecutor standing before the jury, holding a photograph of Lori Houts, young, smiling, full of promise. This brilliant woman was murdered because John Kevin Woodward couldn't accept that his obsessive control over his roommate was ending. Prosecutor methodically reviewed the evidence. Fingerprints on Lori's car, witness testimony about Woodward's threats, and DNA on the murder weapon. Each piece tells part of the story. Together, they prove guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The DNA evidence formed the prosecution's strongest argument. John Kevin Woodward's genetic material is embedded in the rope that strangled Lori Houts. Science doesn't lie, science doesn't forget, and science has given us the proof we needed. Prosecutor emphasized the personal nature of strangulation, a crime requiring proximity, sustained intent, and intimate control. This wasn't random violence. This was personal rage carried out by someone who knew the victim, resented her presence, and chose to silence her forever. Defense attorney rose for his final appeal to the jury. The prosecution asks you to convict based on 30-year-old evidence and degraded genetic material. Time erodes. Certainty. Memory fades. Science has limitations. He challenged the DNA evidence one final time, suggesting that indirect transfer or contamination could explain Woodward's genetic presence on the rope. Reasonable doubt exists when questions remain unanswered, but prosecutors' rebuttal dismantled the defense arguments. The defendant's DNA wasn't just on the rope, it was embedded in the fibers used to tie the knots around Lori's neck. There is no innocent explanation for that evidence, prosecutor concluded with an emotional appeal. Lori Houts was 25 years old when she was murdered. She should have had decades of life ahead of her. Instead, her future was stolen by jealous rage. Science has finally given us the tools to prove who stole it. The jury received their instructions and retired to begin deliberations. The jury deliberated for 2 days, carefully reviewing evidence that spanned 3 decades. They examined crime scene photographs, studied DNA analysis reports, and discussed witness testimony that painted a disturbing picture of obsession and rage. On the second afternoon, they sent a note to judge indicating they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as news spread through the community and across social media platforms. Lori's family sat in the front row, holding hands as they waited for the culmination of their 30-year pursuit of justice. Her sister clutched the same photograph she'd carried to every hearing, every press conference, every moment when hope seemed lost. Woodward sat impassively at the defense table, showing no emotion as jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Cameras captured every angle of the historic moment. In the matter of People versus John Kevin Woodward, jury foreman announced, "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps and suppressed sobs. Lori's sister collapsed into tears of relief and renewed grief. After 31 years, someone had finally been held accountable for her sister's death. Judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements and legal preparations. Woodward was remanded to custody pending sentencing. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Jeff Rosen addressed a crowd of reporters and supporters. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," he declared. "Science gave us the tools to finally prove what we always knew, that John Kevin Woodward murdered Lori Houts in cold blood." Lieutenant, now retired, but present for the verdict, spoke about the investigation's long journey. "This case proves that evidence preservation matters. Every fiber, every sample, every detail we saved 30 years ago made this conviction possible. The rope that had waited in silence had finally delivered its testimony. Justice had been served, though it could never restore what time had taken away." Lori's sister stepped to the microphone outside the courthouse, her voice trembling with emotion as she addressed the media and gathered supporters. 31 years of grief and hope converged in her words. "My sister Lori was brilliant, kind, and full of dreams," she began. "She was building a career in technology when women weren't welcome in that field. She was making a difference in the world. And someone took all of that away because of jealousy and hatred." She spoke about the family's long journey through grief, false hope, and renewed determination. 2 failed trials in the 1990s had nearly broken their faith in justice, but they'd never stopped believing that truth would eventually emerge. "We kept all of Lori's things," she continued. "We couldn't let her memory fade. We couldn't let her killer believe he'd gotten away with it." The sister revealed that their family had funded forensic research and cold case initiatives, driven by their belief that science would eventually provide the answers they needed. Their tragedy had become a mission to help other families find justice. "When the DNA results came back, I cried for hours," she said. not just from relief, but from grief. All those years we'd waited, all those sleepless nights, all the wondering if we'd ever know the truth, it all came flooding back. She addressed Woodward directly, though he remained in custody. You thought time would erase what you did. You built a new life, became successful, probably convinced yourself that the past was buried. But DNA doesn't forget, evidence doesn't lie. And Lori's voice was just waiting for science to help it speak. The sister concluded with a message for other families enduring similar losses. Never give up hope. Technology keeps advancing. Cold cases are being solved every day. Justice may be delayed, but it's not dead. Community members organized vigils and memorial services, honoring Lori's memory while celebrating the long-awaited justice. The Lori Houts case became a symbol of forensic perseverance and technological triumph. Law enforcement agencies across the country cited it as a model for evidence preservation and cold case investigation. Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory received international recognition for their methodical approach to genetic analysis. Laboratory scientist became a speaker at forensic conferences, explaining how proper evidence, storage, and advancing technology could resurrect decades-old cases. The Houts case proves that no murder is ever truly cold, laboratory scientists told a gathering of investigators. Evidence waits patiently for science to develop the tools needed to read its message. Police departments began reviewing their own cold case files with renewed optimism. Storage facilities upgraded environmental controls. Training programs emphasized evidence preservation techniques that could pay dividends decades in the future. The case inspired federal funding for cold case DNA testing programs. Lori's story became part of the argument for investing in forensic technology and maintaining long-term evidence storage capabilities. Mountain View Police established the Lori Houts Memorial Fund, supporting forensic education and cold case investigation training. Her name became permanently associated with the advancement of justice through science. District Attorney Jeff Rosen reflected on the case's broader implications. Every piece of evidence we preserve today might be the key to solving a case 30 years from now. We owe it to victims and their families to maintain hope and keep improving our methods. The rope that had strangled Lori Houts was retired to permanent evidence storage, its genetic testimony having finally been heard. But its legacy lived on in the cases it would inspire and the techniques it had validated. Woodward received a life sentence without possibility of parole. At 70 years old, he would spend his remaining years in prison, finally paying for a crime he'd thought time had forgiven. The photograph of Lori at her Adobe Systems workstation, young, brilliant, smiling, became a symbol of justice, reborn through technological advancement.